Isn't it kind of, hey, look at that. We are currently streaming. Okay. So, this is where we ended last time. On the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, which continue to be a boogeyman for big businesses for quite some time. Let me just go back to where we are in the book. Here we are, Industrial Workers of the World. All right. Formed from the Western Federation of Miners, became known as the Wobblies for some reason. Brought together skilled and unskilled workers, often used strikes to get what they needed, which was seen as the last resort for a lot of unions, but the IWW they went straight for the strike, which often got them what they needed. And they spread throughout the world. This is an Italian language newspaper here, which just used, an English one, but with an Italian subtitle. And then a couple of strikes here in the U.S. So after all of that, because if you recall last time we discussed the strikes and their various reactions, including Frick bringing in the Pinkertons and shooting up the strikers. We do have some amount of leisure for the working class. The time clocks made things more mechanical for the workers. They were seen as being a little more than, cogs in the machine. Used to be, if you were a farmer or, a worker in the rural regions, you worked from essentially sun up to sundown. But as winter came along, you worked less because there was less sunlight. And your work schedule changed with the seasons because obviously you can't grow really in the winter, especially if you live further north. But with the factory work, you work from the same time every day to the same time that evening. But it did define the difference between work time and leisure time, because again, on the farm, if you're inside at say 10 o'clock at night and you hear the freaking cows bust out of the fence and go stampeding across the pasture, well, you got to go out and get your damn cows. So there wasn't really this demarcation between work time and leisure time. At least with this, once you were done with work, you were done with work. Oh no, the factory is on fire. Well, sucks for them, it's not my job anymore. So, a couple things here. We have sporting events for men, social gatherings for women. Let's see what else. And since women didn't make nearly as much as men, dating became a way for women to be able to afford a meal for the night, which is kind of terrible. But that does now begin intermingling the economic and emotional relationships, where it's like, yeah, we can go on a date so that I can have a meal. Anybody have anything to add to the conversation? Okay, cool. Now, a lot of this was segregated among economic lines. Obviously, the higher class workers had different leisure activities than, the working class. But there were certain things that everybody enjoyed. Around the 1900s, we had the first amusement parks showing up in the U.S. We had Coney Island with the first roller coaster in 1884. Chicago had the world's first Ferris wheel. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, which was designed by George Ferris, 250 feet high, seated 1,440 riders. The book here mentions powered by two 1,000 horsepower steam engines. I've got images of this thing, and it sticks out to me because most of the time when you see stuff from the olden days, it's like, oh yeah, this is, you can recognize it as an older version of what we have today, but it's much smaller and quaint. Like I'm gonna show you guys race cars and whatnot, and they're like, oh wow, this is cute. But the old Ferris wheel is massive. Like stuff you see in today's, county fairs and whatnot are tiny by comparison. It's very strange. And then there was, of course, music, banjos, fiddles, blues, and jazz. And then the emergence of country music in mill towns, especially among, the lower class, and in particular, the African-American population, which, of course, was absorbed into, well, at first it was seen as being something terrible by particularly the white population. It's like, oh, this is the devil's music, and then it got popular. It's like, oh, well, it's okay as long as the white person is playing it. So we, of course, have baseball. Not a lot's changed since then. I mean, you're not really going to modernize baseball, except, I guess, the seating. Riding your bicycles, the tall grass. I don't know why they're out in the field like that. Surely there were some kind of paths. Here we go. Look at these race cars. And this was before, like, the stock cars we think of today that originated in the era of Prohibition. Stock cars were bootlegger cars. This was even before that. I mean, look at these, what are essentially like bicycle tires on essentially an engine wrapped in a car frame. Yeah, that's some old-timey race car stuff there. Go out dancing. That guy's had, I'd say, too much to drink. It looks like he's got more than a drink in him. I don't know. Opium was legal. All I gotta say. All right, Coney Island. This looks like before the roller coaster was built, because it's not advertising the roller coaster, and you'd think that'd be front and center. Surf Avenue, the beach. Hey, you want to go to the beach in New York? No. So here's the roller coaster very early on. I know, again, today it's like, oh, wow, that's quaint and tiny. But, I mean, there's still wooden roller coasters. You can still ride wooden roller coasters today, and they're not much different from this. It's hills and a couple of turns. And it shakes you around a lot. They updated a little bit in this picture, but this is still like 1940s. You can tell from the cars. Yeah, not a lot to add to this. Here is the Ferris wheel. I specifically bring this up because of the size of the gondolas. They're like little rooms. Look how big they are. They remind me of my aunt's sunroom off the back of her house. She lives like in the country club. It's just, it's the size of the front of this room here. These are big ass gondolas. I mean, I imagine it ran slow as hell. I mean, two 1,000 horsepower steam engines, very loud, very slow, I'm sure. But still, my goodness, that's big. And sure, today you'll have ones that are taller, but typically the gondolas aren't rooms. You're not going into a small room to go up that high. Anyway, some music stuff here. Your banjos, your violins, fiddles. Sorry, folks, making the best of what they got. So, this chapter is called "Workers and Farmers in the Age of Organization," and the rest of the chapter is going to be on farmers. So, let's talk about that. So, while workers were, of course, exploited through the organization of labor, well, not labor, but the factories and industrialization, farmers were also impacted in a negative sense. Combine harvester, 1878. This was McCormick's invention that made him all of the money. This caused the production to rise sharply, which, as we've seen, when the markets get flooded, the prices drop because, supply and demand and all of that. Supply is really, really high, then demand's going to drop, and so does price. So the only way to make money is to increase your own supply. And the only way to increase your own supply is to buy into this industrialization, so you have to take out loans to buy all this machinery to increase your own production, but so are all the other farmers, and that's just flooding the market even more, which is causing prices to drop even more. So you're not really making any more money because per unit value is still going down. And while this is happening, the farms are becoming more and more isolated. They didn't really have any kind of support, any kind of like social networking, because they lived so far apart from each other. And also the fact that these farms were either failing entirely or on the brink of failure. Their children often would leave and go to the cities to look for opportunities because that's where all the opportunities were. So the first organization of farmers came not from like the unions for workers, but just to counteract the solitude, to try to push social engagement, cultural interaction, etc. So Oliver H. Kelly formed the Patrons of Husbandry, lectures, agricultural fairs, picnics. This is where you get like this is where the local fairs started. Because if you have the fair here in Florence, well, I say here, there's probably one in this region as well, but up towards Florence. There's always the tent off to the side where they've got all the cows and pigs and whatever, because they started as farmers' fairs, and then they just grew from there. These groups became known as grangers, which is from the French word for granary. Because, if you were a farmer, you had a granary. You had to have somewhere to put your grain. They grew very, very quickly. 14,000 new chapters were established between 1872 and 1874, which is phenomenal growth, especially in the late 1800s. So they began to push into politics a little bit. They set up their farm cooperatives, sell their crops at higher prices, pool funds to buy furnished goods at wholesale prices. So they were working together in order to try to affect the market to some degree. So they would keep their goods off the market until the demand went up, and then they would sell it all at once, and then also pool their resources to buy things at wholesale prices rather than like at market price. So they were gradually pushing into politics, but rather than forming their own party or even lobbying, they just backed whoever seemed to follow whatever legislative interest they were most benefited them. So they did win some legislative victories this way because there were a lot of farmers. And when they were finally working together and talking about what things were better for them, they did have some power behind them. So here we have some farmers. Again, this is looking like the Midwest. It's all very flat. I think I've got a picture of, because there's the old plow. Yeah. So there's the combine harvester in the background there. This up front is actually the steam-powered tractor. They very rarely use it to actually pull anything because it was so heavy and not especially powerful. But they would just park it and hook the machines up to the crankshaft and just use it to run the machines like a regular steam engine. So the harvester there, you put grain or whatever in it, and it would separate the grain from the chaff, or bind the wheat into bundles if you preferred it to do that. But you can see there in the background, it just dumps it all in a pile. Much more efficient than having to do it yourself. Though oftentimes, and again, you can't really do it with a steam-powered tractor unless the soil is really strong. If it's muddy at all, you're just going to bog the tractor down and never be able to get it out again. Usually they'd pull these things behind, horses or oxen. But if you run the combine harvester through a field, you can harvest and bind and run it through the thresher and everything all at once. And it takes care of literal days of work in just a couple of minutes. It's a very impressive machine, but boy, it affected the farms. Here's a nice old medallion somebody saved. Patrons of husbandry. All these weird little symbols always had these like disembodied hands shaking. This is one of the very common like pastoral scenes of how they felt like things should be, where the farmers have their idyllic landscape. You notice no machines out here. The most advanced thing is the plow, and even the plow is not even as advanced as the one I showed you guys. This is what Jefferson would have wanted. Although he probably would have wanted some slaves in there too, because Jefferson. This is an image in the book that I found, and it's really quite good. The book actually has it titled as the Granger Movement. So around the borders here, you have a bunch of different groups. So starting from the top left, I plead for all, I rule for all, so I guess you've got the lawyers and politicians. Below that, the trains, I carry for all. I bull and bear for all, the, it says Board of Trade, so I guess like stock market. This one's a bit rude. The general brokerage, I fleece you all. They didn't appreciate the broker. This one is always amusing to me. Just some dude with like a chemistry set behind him. I physic you all. Sure, whatever that means. I buy and sell for all, I steal for all, I fight for all, I preach for all. And then here in the middle, the biggest one obviously, the farmers, I feed you all. You need to eat, and yet the farmers are always at the bottom of the social totem pole, as it were. I mean, and even to this day, if you're not a large, I mean, like a massive farm, you know, backed by a huge corporation like Monsanto, you're probably not going to survive. And even like the mid-sized farms, when I say mid-sized, I mean hundreds of acres, they typically only survive because of government subsidies that go back as far as World War II. Because we in this country tend to keep food prices low, which, you know, today it's like, oh, but inflation. It's like, yeah, but in the rest of the world, food prices are higher than they are here, because farmers make more money than they do here. So yeah, it's just that, like, the culture's different here, and things are kept low in certain parts of society. So farmers tend to bear the brunt of that. So this leads to, well, not quite the Farmers Alliance just yet, but just to show what these acts and laws end up doing. Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act, which established the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887. So this was to regulate railroads, because what tended to happen was that the big railroads were given rebates, which is to say they were given discounts on shipping, which very quickly added up and allowed them to ship massive amounts of stuff back and forth, while the smaller local railroads were not, and they were very quickly run out of business. So the Interstate Commerce Commission was meant to keep this from happening. You know, let the local smaller railroads maintain their stake in the business. Well, it didn't take long before advocates of these big railway lines soon were sitting on the board of the ICC and began changing the laws around, or at least enforce the laws in such a way that it aided the big railways. Because, of course, much like the Sherman Antitrust Act that was supposed to crack down on big businesses, was used against the unions. So in the late 1880s, Grangers began pulling out of politics, but the advocacy for farmers was not gone, as they began being replaced by farmers' alliances. Now, the Grangers didn't transform into the farmers' alliances, but the representation, I would argue, was certainly just shifted over. So we had the Northwestern Farmers Alliance in the Great Plains by Milton George. Dr. Charles W. McCune set up the Southern Farmers Alliance, which ended up being larger, 4 million members. Of course, racism, so they excluded African Americans. However, they did set up their own alliance, the Colored Farmers Alliance, which had about 250,000 members itself. So we have 3 main farmers alliances. I imagine there were probably a lot more little ones in little regions here and there, but these were the main 3. And one particular recruiter for these alliances was Mary Elizabeth Lease, advocated for the fight against capitalist exploitation, and while she was there, women's rights too, because, why not? She's going to be important later. Remember her. So one major thing these alliances pushed for was this sub-treasury system. It was kind of what the Grangers had been doing, but on a larger scale. Basically, the U.S. Treasury would store crops and take these and so they would store the crops, and in return, the alliances would take these federal loans, and then when the prices for the crops went up, the alliances would redeem their federal loans, get the crops back, and then sell those crops for higher prices. Obviously, you can't exactly store, tomatoes or something in a treasury somewhere, but stuff like grain would store pretty well for a while. So this is just a larger, federally regulated system of holding the crops in some secure location until the market demand goes up. And I found another horrifying image for the ICC. It's not quite the train centipede that I had before, but it's pretty close. It's a horrifying train snake. Whoever decided that putting a face on a train was cute and decided to make Thomas the Tank Engine was apparently a monster, because every time they put on a face on a train back then, it was horrific. I don't know how it took until this year that somebody decided to make a horror game out of it. So we have the Texas Farmers Alliance, 1878, the most good for the most people, wisdom, justice, moderation, free trade, etc. So more on the Farmers Alliance. I know this is a big block of text, but a lot went on, and I couldn't really break that up as much. To put this simply, there was a push for these alliances to join together into a single group, because then they'd be able to better exercise their power. So 1889, there was this push to merge the Northwestern and Southern alliances, also bringing in the Knights of Labor. Remember them from last chapter or earlier this chapter? Well, hey, they're here now again, and bringing in the Colored Farmers Alliance. So all 3 Farmers Alliances and the Knights of Labor. So this began the National Farmers Alliance. So that's, again, all 3 and the Knights of Labor. They met with the Industrial Union in Ocala to try to gain more power for the plain people, tariff reduction, governmental ownership of banks and railroads, direct election of U.S. senators, which wasn't a thing back then. You only elected your local representatives, and they would elect senators. So you had no say in who went to the U.S. Senate. Adoption of a secret ballot, which also wasn't a thing back then. Provisions for voters to initiate and decide public issues, which also wasn't a thing back then. It's amazing all these things that these farmers' alliances decided to work on that we think of today as just like, oh yeah, that's just normal stuff that weren't like part of the national election conversation. However, the sticking point for them was that they wanted the government to expand silver coinage and cause inflation, which would help their debt-addled farmers to pay off the pre-inflation debts, because inflation is weird like that, I guess. And that's going to be like the main topic for a while, is the silver coinage thing. The Eastern bankers opposed this. Senator John Sherman halted the purchase of more silver by the Treasury Department. Under the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, they purchased more silver, but they did not guarantee it be made into currency. So, I mean, the government can have as much silver as it wants, but if it doesn't make it into currency, it's not going to affect the economy. So there were some alliance members that advocated using paper currency, paper money rather, to expand the currency and then therefore inflation. But a large part of the organization were silver miners in the West, so they had to keep the issue on silver. Their demands were not met, so they created their own political party, which was the Populist Party, and we will get into that in just a moment. So this is the final form of the farmers' alliances. But first, some really amusing propaganda here. Free Coinage Act is drowning Colombia, which, you know, is just the personification of America, and our credit there in her hand. Oh no, the silver is gonna get us, I guess. So, the populace. The National Farmers Alliance entered the political ring by creating the People's Party of America, which eventually simply became the Populist Party. And they brought in several ideas to further expand their political appeal. Endorse a graduated income tax, higher tax rates on higher income levels, 8-hour workday, ban use of Pinkerton mercenaries in labor disputes. Boy, that'd be nice. Immigration restriction to reduce the number of unskilled laborers in the market, which they saw as driving down wages. They also pushed for women's suffrage because they remembered all the help that Mary Lease and women like her did for the farmers' alliances. And while there was obviously a lot of African Americans helping in the formation of the farmers' alliances and, of course, the Populist Party, there were no specific suggestions for reducing racial discrimination or segregation. They focused simply on reducing the plight of the workers regardless of their race. Exactly. So, the election of 1892, Populists selected the Union Civil War General James B. Weaver. He came in third, which, you know, in a race where there's not a whole lot of people, not great. But he did get more than 1 million popular votes, 22 electoral votes. So not awful. actually. And at the state level, Populists managed to get a hold of 10 congressional representatives, 5 senators, 3 governors, and 1,500 state legislatures. And then in the midterm election, they had a 42% vote increase. So yeah, Populists actually had a fairly decent foothold right after their official creation. Now, granted, as we've seen, they didn't just come out of nowhere. These farmers' alliances had been around a while, and even before the farmers' alliances, the Grangers had existed for a couple of years before that. So this idea, or the ideas rather, that these alliances and these farmer unions beforehand had created were not new to people. So the Populists did have a bit of a base to build on. But still, for like the first year that this party existed, they did pretty well. That's not awful. Here is, where's the, here it is. Here Lies Prosperity, 1895. Because we have 1893, John Sherman, Grover Cleveland, etc. Because we'll get to that. Lies Prosperity, enslaved in 1863, stabbed in the back in 1873, assassinated in 1893. Yeah, there was a economic downturn like every decade in the 1800s, it seemed like. Like if you type in Panic of 18 in Google, it'll have like basically every decade. It's like, man, 1800s, not a good century. Free coinage. There's a good day's work, and the path is clear for decent people. Yeah. See how well that goes. The platform of lunacy. People not really agreeing here with the People's Party. So we have Farmers Alliance. Yeah, that's true. The old Greenback Party. We didn't really talk about the Greenback Party. And I don't really have a lot of background information on them personally, so we're just going to leave that one alone. Knights of Labor. That's true. Old Granger Party. There wasn't really we didn't talk much about a Granger Party, but yeah, there's Granger backing. Socialists, Free Silver Party, yeah, kind of. Communists was this after the second Comintern? Prohibition Party, I've got nothing on that. And then anarchists, let's throw them in too. Yeah, there was a lot of disparaging remarks thrown towards the People's Party, which, as much of this as I might disagree with, there was a lot of different factors pulling at the People's Party, which will eventually cause trouble for them in the future. Whether they had anarchists and communists and et cetera in them, I don't know. But it was hard for them to all agree on what their platform stood for. And thus we had the Depression in the 1890s. And this is a year we've talked about multiple times this chapter. 1893 was a bad year. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad went bankrupt in 1893, and because American businesses tended to be all human centipede about how they did things. One went down and the rest went down with it. Quarter of American railroads went into bankruptcy and the entire economy crashed with them. Apparently, it's just how things go. One railroad goes down, so do the rest, and then the economy just crashes alongside it. May 5th, 1893, Black Friday, the stock market collapsed. I mean, it wasn't just like one railroad went down and it just caused everything to happen all at once. There was already economic issues. Europe had been dealing with similar economic problems. Many investors have been pulling out of American stock markets, and thus gold was being pulled out of the country, so the banks crashed, and the farmers were unable to get credit from the banks, and thus the farmers started going into bankruptcy as well, so it was a domino effect. It always is. And then Grover Cleveland, easily one of our most ineffective presidents, made things worse by doing almost nothing. So there was a lot of agitation among the unemployed, so much so that Cleveland and others were concerned this would spark another rebellion, which is to say another civil war. So in the spring of 1894, Jacob Coxey, who was a populist from Ohio, marched to Washington, and others joined him, demanding that Cleveland and Congress create a federal public works program to provide jobs for the unemployed. You know, like FDR would do in, see, this is 94, 40 years? So he was a little ahead of his time. This became known as Coxey's Army. It was about 500 people by the time he got to Washington, because like people would see the group marching and be like, hey, what's going on? Oh, we're going to Washington to make the president give us jobs. And like, okay, cool, we're going too. And yeah, it was a pretty decent group by the time they got there. Cleveland would not listen to their demands, and Coxey was arrested for trespassing. So we have the War of Wealth. Run on the bank, Christ was Pharaoh's greatest financial institution, yada, yada, yada. Here's the Commonweal Army leaving Brightwood camps. That's Coxey and his boys. Where is, there they are, D.C. There's that picture. Here we are. Here they are at camp. Somebody brought his dog, which I appreciate. I do like the guy that's like holding up his trumpet. It's like, yeah, we got marching music now. Unfortunately, this, and I swear it says Puck, it's damaged, so I don't have the full thing down here at the bottom, but it's something about Coxey. And obviously it's there on his hat. Yeah, just this march of just like 500 dudes who wanted federal jobs, like terrified the current administration. Anyway, Cleveland makes things worse. Not unlike Hoover did in the Great Depression. So after dismissing Coxey, Cleveland sent the federal troops to break the strike at Pullman's factory. We talked about that earlier in the chapter. Obviously, the big businesses were happy about this because that meant that they could just count on the government to roll in and shoot the strikers if they needed to. Working class Americans realized that the president and the government weren't really in a position to help fix the economy. And at the start of Cleveland's term, he had a great quote that didn't age very well. Now, obviously, this was right before the economic collapse, so he didn't know this was about to happen. But he said, while the people should patriotically and cheerfully support their government, its functions do not include the support of the people. So, hey, you should all support the government, but the government doesn't have to support you. And he clearly stood by that as the economy collapsed. He then convinced Congress to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, which, while it wasn't super helpful for the silver miners, it certainly hurt them by getting rid of it. Hurt farmers in the Great Plains because obviously having more silver increased inflation, and therefore it was good for paying off their debts. Because when inflation goes up, basically, this is a real simplistic version. When inflation goes up, the basic value of the money goes down. So if you owe, like, say, $10,000 in, 1860, and then in 1870 inflation goes up, that $10,000 isn't really worth as much as it was in 1860. So it's easier to pay off, essentially. Yeah. Also, removing silver backing from currency caused a lot of investors to withdraw their gold from the U.S. Treasury, which hurt the economy even more. So good work, Cleveland. So to keep the government from completely going under, he created a deal with J.P. Morgan. Remember J.P. Morgan? Well, he's back. To help sell government bonds, so the investors made a big profit while the government didn't go bankrupt. Now, for the middle and lower classes, this was seen as a corrupt deal between the government to help the rich get richer while the poor got poorer. And boy, yeah, that was essentially what was going on. Almost like when there was, a big thing that happened here the last couple of years, and there was like a massive shift in wealth where like the top, 1, 2, maybe 3% of the wealth in the country gained like another 600 billion or something. I don't know, just something I heard a lot. The fellow there with the big face, he was clearly a senator who was well known for his beard and his assets in the silver mines, because he's shown a lot in some of these images. And I also don't know what the hell is happening here. I don't know why there's this like weird puppeteer thing going on. Here again is Uncle Sam pulling business interests, Columbia, rare version Columbia, out of the silver flood. Repeal the Sherman Law by the 53rd Congress. Boy, for public opinion. These things are weird. Modern day political cartoons are also real dumb, but this is like a whole nother level. Well, no, I take it back. Modern political cartoons don't even have this level of art. Pied Piper, which again, just weird. So the election of 1896, this was actually very important in how things are going to go going forward. So the Democrats nominated William Jennings Bryan, farmer's advocate, favored silver coinage. So the populists, instead of nominating their own candidate, they just threw in behind Bryan. Republicans nominated William McKinley, supported gold standard, high tariffs on manufactured goods. Bryan went all around the country campaigning, doing the typical thing. McKinley stayed home, and his campaign manager did all the work. McKinley won handily. 51% of the popular vote, 61% of the electoral vote. And this was the first time since Grant, 20 years before, that a president actually won the majority of the popular vote, because there's usually more than, two candidates. And I mean, a substantial amount of the electoral vote. And due to the major victory here, Republicans were given an edge for the next 30 years. So there's a couple of reasons behind this. Republicans were able to bring in both corporate capitalists and their workers, and also a lot of voters blamed Cleveland and thus the Democratic Party for failing to end the Depression. And I mean, Cleveland certainly didn't do a very good job in that. I mean, not that like a single person is responsible for the economic systems of what's going on in the government, but like when you're actively making decisions that are making things worse, that's going to kind of fall on you. So the election of 1896 broke the political stalemate. Republicans had the support of the wage workers and their businessmen, veterans, and African American supporters that they typically had. So this would put Republicans in power for quite some time. Really? 30 years. That's basically almost until FDR. So here we have Bryan and his supporters, and and the other guy. Yeah. There's Mr. Big Beard and his silver syndicate there again. Gulliver bound down by the Democratic Lilliputians? I don't know. Gulliver's Travels. Again, what is happening with this beard? He's not the only one with the beard. There's Whitebeard again. Oh, I always forget about this horrifying image. Here's William Jennings Bryan, like, eating the Democratic Party. Bryan is the ablest worker for selling money. The more he talks, the more McKinley wins. Well, that's not even wins, is it? The more he weighs, aha. Yeah, because they're weighing on a scale. Whatever. Shoulder to shoulder, et cetera, et cetera. Here's some horrifying imagery. Yeah, this is anti-McKinley. And also anti-Rothschild, so we're going to be anti-Semitic as well. Why not? There's a real dumb one there. Gold standard and the silver standard. All right, let's finish this up. So after the election of 1896, the Populist Party tore itself apart. Let's see what we got. Due to these internal divisions that it had, like I had said before, that hot air balloon, while it wasn't totally accurate, it also wasn't totally inaccurate. Some populist leaders didn't want to emphasize the free silver issue, which would lose them support of the silver miners. Others either fought in or had relatives who fought in the Civil War on the side of the Union and therefore didn't want to throw in on the side of the Democrats because they saw them as being the ones who were part of the rebellion. So, you know, just a bit of a working with the devil, as you will. And then also the nation was beginning to recover from the Depression. And while this was certainly good for the industrial workers, they couldn't really work with farmers past this point because the goal for the farmers was to keep crop prices high. And if you're keeping crop prices high, that's going to keep food prices high. And if you're an industrial worker living in a city, barely making it, you don't want food prices to be high. So it's going to be hard working with a group that is pushing for higher, for you, food prices. So yeah, that tore the party apart pretty good. Also racism. Southern opponents disenfranchised poor white and most black voters, poll tax, literacy test requirement. Tom Watson, who had been championing aid for blacks, went back to bigotry because it was just easier that way, I guess. And finally, their legacy. This is literally the conclusion, so we can finish up before we run out of time. Despite the fact that the populists did fall apart by the end, they did leave a lasting legacy. Direct election of senators, graduated income tax, government regulation of businesses and banking. Apparently their sub-treasury system sort of exists in a different version today, the Commodity Credit Corporation. And also created what would eventually become like a farmers' lobby system, Farm Bureau and other groups, that helped farmers survive this industrial revolution because farmers weren't doing very well. And until like we had farmer subsidies and whatnot between the world wars, farmers were left on their own and they weren't in a very good position. Now, these ideas weren't in law yet. We're going to see that going forward, not next chapter, but I think the one after, the progressive era. So keep this in mind. But yeah, so the populists had a lot of good ideas. It just didn't quite catch on yet. So yeah, see you guys on Wednesday. That's it. Bring your chest back up here all the way out.